All right, let's start. So today I want to talk about interest rates. You know, if you have followed the news, there is a lot of debate on these days on where will the interest rate in the U.S. end at the end of this tightening cycle. So I'll show you there has been a very aggressive monetary policy trying to fight the inflationary episode we're going through, and that's done through interest rates. And the question that I want to address today is, well, how is it that the interest rate is determined? So when a central bank decides to hike interest rates, how do they do that? Okay? And obviously, this is about financial markets. Interest rates are set in financial markets. And financial markets are very, very complicated. So we're going to keep it very, very simple. We're going to introduce more complexity later on in the course, but still we're going to keep it pretty simple because our main objective in studying financial markets is really to achieve some sort of understanding of how the interest rate policy that the central bank controls is determined. So before I get into the specifics, so let's see some trivia here. Who knows who that person is? Okay. You, sir. Jerome Powell, exactly. And who's Jerome Powell? The chair of the Federal Reserve system in the U.S., which is the central bank of the U.S. Okay, so that was an easy one, and you know, if you are into financial markets, everyone is worried about what this guy is thinking and his friends are thinking at this moment because they determine the interest rate. How do they do that? Well, that's what we're going to talk about later on. A little trickier. Who is this? No, that's cheating. Katsuo Ueda, he's the next president of the Bank of Japan, the Central Bank of Japan. And an interesting, there are many interesting things of him, but he's a graduate from our program, the PhD program, which actually is an incredibly successful program at producing major central bankers. Ben Bernanke is our alumnus. He was the chairman of the central bank, the chair of the central bank of the Fed during the financial crisis. Mario Draghi is one of our graduates. Mario Draghi was the most successful central banker in Europe. He was the president of the ECB, European Central Bank, for many years, and in particular during the global financial crisis and the European crisis, which followed the global financial crisis. I mean, but you name it. Stan Fischer in the past of the Bank of Israel. Nowadays, Phil Lowe of the chair of the Reserve Bank of Australia. In Chile, we have had 2 or 3 presidents and so on. So if this is your career, this is a good program. You should join our program. You may end up in a good place. But that's the next one for Japan. And Japan is a very interesting place from the point of view of monetary policy, precisely because they haven't had much space to do conventional monetary policy, so they have had to do lots of unconventional things from the point of view of what a central bank typically does. But today we're going to study conventional things, and we'll talk a little bit more about unconventional things later in the course. Now, some institutional knowledge. This is again, in the US, the central bank of the US is called the Federal Reserve System, and it's a system, really. It has the Board of Governors, which sits in Washington, D.C., and there are 7 governors. And the governors are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. And the president of that board so the president of the Fed will be one of those members. Okay. Now, in addition to that, the U.S. has a Federal Reserve Bank system. There are 12 regional banks. There's one in Boston. In fact, if you look at the skyline near the waterfront, there is a building built out of recycled aluminum, well, that's the Reserve Bank of Boston. And of those 12 regional banks, they rotate. So the policy interest rate is set in a committee, which is called the FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee. And the voting members of that committee are the 7 governors plus 4 out of the 12, and they rotate. Most of them rotate. The only one I think does not rotate is the president of the New York Fed, because they are so important, because that's the financial heart of the U.S., that you certainly want that president to be involved in interest rate decisions. And it's really the Fed that is in charge of communication with financial markets, which is a huge thing for the Fed. Okay? They are in New York, and they're crucial for that. Okay, so those are the people that, and in most places around the world, you're going to have at least something equivalent to the 7 governors out there. Okay, most places. Obviously, the ECB is different because it's multiple countries, so each country sends one member. No? But otherwise, it tends to be like the US without the regional banks. So why do we care about monetary policy? Well, because I think it's one of the main policy tools you have in the short run. Remember, in this part of the course, we're trying to understand output in the short term. And one of the main policy levers, I mean, how can you affect output, is monetary policy. Which one is the other one? There are 2 major ones. Eh? Fiscal policy, exactly. And fiscal policy we did look at in the previous lecture. Remember, we said an expansionary fiscal policy is an increase in G where a decline in T would lead to an expansion in aggregate demand. Equilibrium output would go up. Okay? So fiscal policy is something you always use in deep recessions. But monetary policy is much more nimble. It's a bunch of people that need to meet and just change the interest rate. Anything that is fiscal, there are some automatic stabilizers, by the way. So automatically fiscal policy becomes more expansionary during recessions and stuff like that. But any deviation from the typical automatic stabilizers require Congress to approve things. It's a long process. And so it's not something that can react as quickly as monetary policy can. Okay. So that's what we're going to look. That's the reason why monetary policy is important for us at this point. Then there are medium and long run issues. Fiscal policy still affects equilibrium output in the medium and long run. Monetary policy is much less effective at that. It's very difficult to change sort of equilibrium growth or things like that with monetary policy. It's only pretty minor. Most of the impact of monetary policy in the medium and long run is really on the price level and inflation, more than on real activity. Okay? But in the short run, it's very powerful for reasons that we're going to discuss in this and the next lecture. Okay. So as I said, well, monetary policy acts through financial markets. I think it's a very interesting part of my research agenda is about that. I think the central bank is a very strange institution because most of its mandates are in terms of what happens in the goods market. It says, you know, you don't try not to get into recession, try to get us out of a recession and so on. But unlike fiscal policy, which has tools that are directly aimed at the goods market, remember, it's a purchases by the government of goods. So if there is insufficient demand for goods, the fiscal policy, the fiscal authority can go out there and buy goods. That creates more demand. The central bank is given the same mandate, aside from price stability and things like that, we're going to worry about later, but it doesn't have any tools. The central bank, if there is insufficient demand, the central bank cannot go out there and buy hamburgers. I mean, fiscal policy can do that and expand the demand for hamburgers, but not monetary policy. What monetary policy can do is buy bonds, buy instruments in the financial markets, and through that affects real activity. So it's the fastest policy tool, but it's the most indirect in a sense because it has to go through financial markets. And those channels can be very complex, but obviously we're not in the business of complicating things in this course, so we're going to make it very, very simple. We're going to assume that financial markets only have 2 instruments, obviously a huge simplification. There are millions of financial instruments out there. But we want to isolate two instruments because this happens to be the instruments where where the central banks typically participate. They affect all asset prices around. But the direct interventions typically, recently has been a little different, but typically is only in this kind of instruments. And so we want to focus all our analysis on those two instruments for now. Later on, we're going to talk about equity and stuff like that. But just to isolate how monetary policy works, it's sufficient to just focus on two financial instruments. So we're going to assume that people have their wealth in only two forms, in two financial assets. One, we're going to call it money, and the other one, we're going to call it bonds. Okay? Money, the characteristic of money, what we call money, there are many definitions of money, M1, M2, M3, M4, but let's keep it very simple. Money essentially means something that you can use very easily for transactions, okay? So, for example, the most important example of money, not the largest, but the most important one is cash, currency, okay? You can buy anything with cash. It's no problem whatsoever. Now, a characteristic that money typically does not have is that it doesn't give you any return. You don't invest in cash. You have cash because you need to do transactions, but it's not the way you get a return. And so money, that's what it's going to mean for us. It's something that is used in transactions, but it pays no interest rate, no interest. There's no interest on that. A bond is going to be the polar opposite. It's going to be something that pays a positive interest rate. So if you buy a bond for 100, for 95, you're going to get 100 a year from now, say. So you get something out of that bond. But it's not very useful for transactions. I mean, you cannot go and buy your lunch with a bond. You get the piece of bond for that. And many things cannot be, even within financial markets, you cannot buy asset with asset. You have to go through some process in which you can sell something, get cash, and with cash, you pay for the other stuff. Not necessarily cash, it could be other forms of money, but typically financial instruments need to be sold before you can buy something else. You don't swap them, it's not a barter or anything like that. Okay, but this is what it means for us. So this, whenever you see something like this, it's always interesting for an economist. Why? Any economist, microeconomist or whatever. What have I done there that makes, economics is about decisions, and then it's about equilibrium, okay? It's decisions and equilibrium. What makes people decide how much capital? There's a decision to be made here. There's a trade-off, okay? If I need to do lots of transactions, I better sort of bias my portfolio towards cash, towards money. If I don't need to do lots of transactions, and the interest rate is very high, particularly, this is an issue today. Today, interest rates are very high. Nobody cared about bonds or anything, 2 years ago when the interest rate was 0. But today, interest rate is 5%. So it's an issue. You're not going to, if you want to keep it in cash, you're going to give up a lot of return. Okay? So there's a decision to be made. There's a portfolio decision. And that's always interesting for economists. So let's talk about that decision. And we're going to talk, you can describe this decision either from the side of bonds or from the side of money. We're going to describe it from the side of money, because there's a total amount of wealth, and you have to decide what to allocate it to. So, it suffices if I tell you there's a total amount of wealth, and if I tell you how much you allocate to money, then I'm telling you implicitly how much you are allocating to bonds. It's a complement of that, okay? So I can do the analysis either way. But I'm going to do it through money, which is the way it's normally done. So money demand, if I plot it in the space of M, money, and the interest rate is a downward sloping curve. Why is it a downward sloping curve?
The interest rate is higher, it pays off more to have bonds, your utility shifted.
Exactly. Your decision, if the interest rate is very high, is to go more towards bonds. If the interest is very low, I don't care too much about bonds. I'd rather keep the thing that helps me transact, which is money. Okay? And it's interesting because for most of your adult life, you have lived in a world in which that was not a very interesting decision, actually, no? Because interest rates were very close to zero. Now you're living in a different environment. Interest rates are, for the first time, sort of high. For you, the bigger decision between investing in equity, say, and cash, but bonds and these are safe bonds, by the way, U.S. Treasuries and things like that. And money is not something you have to worry about. Okay, good. What I'm saying is interest rates were around here, so you were all in cash one way or the other, and now interest rates are a lot high. The other thing that, so that's a movement along the curve. No? I'm plotting something in the space of interest rate, money and interest rate, then when I tell you what happens when the interest rate rises, I'm asking you for a movement along the curve, okay? So if I raise interest rate, I move along the curve up. So the second thing that we have there is, argument we have is something that shifts the curve, because it's not part of my axis, so it will shift the curve. It's a parameter for each of these curves. And that's nominal income. So in particular, if nominal income goes up, I'm showing you there that money demand goes out, meaning for any given level of interest rate, you're going to demand more money. Why do you think that's the case? And again, I'm looking here at the aggregate, but it applies to an individual as well. So if for the same level of wealth, now nominal GDP is higher. Remember that nominal GDP is the same as nominal expenditure here, okay? So if nominal GDP is higher, then that means there's going to be more transactions because there's going to be more expenditure, okay? And therefore, you need more of the thing that is useful for transactions, okay? Money demand goes up. The second point to highlight is that, you know, while in most places we use Y, here I'm using $Y, nominal Y. Why do you think that's that? Why don't I just put there real GDP rather than nominal GDP? Is it a typo? Let's go in steps. Suppose that prices are totally fixed and real GDP goes up. That means that this economy needs more transactions because there's going to be more expenditure there, okay? So that explains that, yeah, when real output goes up, then money demand goes up. When I say money demand goes up, I said for any given interest rate, we have more money demand, okay? Now, fix real output, and I tell you, suppose that the price of goods doubles. Do you think you need more money to transact? Of course, you know, because it's the same, it's equivalent. Now, money is dollars. I have $10, and now prices are twice what they used to be. Well, I'm going to need more dollars to transact. Okay? So that's the reason we have nominal GDP here rather than real GDP. Okay, good. So let's now determine the interest rate, and I'm going to do it in the simplest possible model first. And by simplest, I mean here in particular, no banks, no intermediaries. Okay, so there's only a central bank and people. Okay, so suppose that the central bank decides that it wants to, this is the way monetary policy used to be conducted. Suppose it decides that it wants to offer $M to the economy. The central bank is the one that produces the, at this moment in which I have no intermediaries, money is really currency, okay? The only one that can produce currency, forget Bitcoin, only one that can produce currency is the central bank, okay? I mean, dollars, no one else can produce dollars. Watch out when we talk about banks later on. In this economy I'm describing, there are no banks. The only one that can produce dollars, currency, is the central bank. Any other one that produces dollars, that's illegal, okay? So it's a central bank. So the central bank can decide how much money to supply. And suppose it decides to supply M. That's it. It's a decision. Well, what is the, now for the first time I can answer the question is, well, what is the interest rate in this environment? Why do I know that? Because I have a money supply, I have a money demand, the intersection at this level of money supply, the equilibrium interest rate, that is the interest rate that is consistent with money demand equal to money supply, is that one. Okay. Is it clear? So I have my money demand, and I'm saying the central bank, suppose the central bank decides to supply M, well, in equilibrium, that will be the interest rate. Okay? That's the way the interest rate is determined. Now, suppose that the central bank increases. Remember, the goal of this lecture is that we get to understand how is it that interest rate is determined. How is it that the Fed, the central bank, determines the interest rate. Here, we said, look, the central bank decides on a certain amount of money, and then the market determines what the interest rate is. And this is the way monetary policy used to be conducted. The central banks would typically decide the amount of money in the system. It was called monetary aggregates. The amount of money in the system, and then the market would determine the interest rate. It turned out that that was a nightmare. And so now that's not what central banks do. And it was a nightmare because this money demand that looks so peaceful here, in practice, is moving around all the time for a variety of reasons. You know, even holidays affect the money demand and all that. So if you fix the monetary aggregates, and money demand is moving all over the place, what happens? Suppose that the central bank says, I'm going to offer this amount of M. That's it. And now I tell you, money demand is moving all over the place. There are weeks that have 3 days of weekend, there are others that have vacations in between, or there's a Super Bowl and lots of people decide to buy tickets or whatever, or beer, so whatever. Well, no, because when you say shortage, I mean, it depends what you mean by shortage. But so you could be right with that part of the answer. But when you say excess demand, then I have a problem, because that's true only if the interest rate doesn't move. But in a situation in which a central bank fixes M and lets the market do its thing, then the interest rate will not be fixed. And that's exactly the problem, that the interest rate becomes very, very volatile if you do it only through monetary aggregates, because this guy is moving all over the place. And so imagine what happens. If the demand shifts up, then in equilibrium, interest rate goes up, precisely to avoid your excess demand. No? Because if this thing goes up, I have an excess demand at that interest rate. But what will happen in equilibrium is the interest rate will go up, and so until the excess demand disappears. Now, in central banks like the US central bank, the Fed, they can control this stuff fairly well. Many other central banks don't have that. If you look at the Bank of China, for example, they have lots of high-frequency movements in interest rate because they are not very good at doing this stuff. It's not that easy to do, okay? To control an interest rate, for example, to keep it fixed. But the central bank used to do that. That's what I'm saying. It used to do that. I'm saying in practice, this system wasn't very good because in practice, the money is moving around for a lot of idiosyncratic reasons. Okay, some of them are idiosyncratic, some of them are very predictable. There was a lot of panic around the shift of the year 2000, that the ATMs would stop working and stuff like that. So there was a massive increase in money demand because people wanted to have cash just in case ATMs stopped working. Okay, and so there are some things that are predictable and so on, but you can get very large fluctuations. So in practice, what central banks do nowadays is they tell you what the interest rate is, and then they offer whatever M the market needs for that interest rate. That's the way modern monetary policy works. Okay? I'll tell you a little bit more about that. So let's see what happens here suppose that the Fed, for reasons that you'll understand better in the next lecture, suppose the Fed decides that they want to have an expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy means it's going to expand M. It was offering a certain amount of M, and now it decides to offer more of that M. So what happens in equilibrium? Well, we start from an equilibrium here. If the interest rate remains at that level, now we have an excess supply of money. Okay? And the only way to restore that equilibrium is by people demanding more money. And when will people demand more money? Well, when the interest rate is lower. Okay, so excess demand, the interest rate starts declining, then demand for money starts catching up with a new higher supply of money, okay? And you end up with a lower interest rate, okay? So that's an expansion in monetary policy, an increase in M that leads to a decline in the interest rate. Again, modern central banks don't tell you we're going to increase M by 20%. What they tell you is we're going to cut interest rate by, say, 50 basis points. When they tell you that they're going to cut interest rate by 50 basis points, they're reading you this axis. But behind that operation, there must have been an increase in money supply. And then it comes all the fine-tuning that they have to do now, so the interest rate remains there when demand is vibrating around that thing there. But when we say an expansionary monetary policy, we really mean cutting interest rates. How is it the interest rate is cut? Effectively by an increase in the money supply. But they don't tell you that they are doing that, but that's what they're doing, okay? Good. So nowadays, we're in the opposite process. We're moving that way, no? Up. But you've seen, in every single meeting now for the last 7 meetings or so, we have seen a hike in interest rates, okay? Well, they don't tell you that, but they're saying we're going to cut money supply and moving in that direction. No? That direction. Because if they move in that direction, then interest rates go up. Okay. It's clear? Good. What else shifts? This is a different kind of shift. Suppose that nominal income goes up. And this is happening all the time. Nominal income is growing in most economies most of the time, unless you're in a recession. Nominal income is growing. It's growing for two reasons. One, because we have inflation, and the other one is because real output is growing. That means that typically, in an average year, money demand is shifting to the right. Okay? So if money demand shifts to the right and money supply does not change, then what happens to the interest rate? Money demand goes up, money supply doesn't change. What happens to the interest rate? It increases because at this interest rate here, we have an excess demand for money. So we have to reduce the money demand. How do we reduce money demand? By increasing the interest rate. That's the way we get there. So that's yet another reason why it's not a good idea to be targeting monetary aggregates. The Fed tells you we want the interest rate at 5%, say, okay? And then the economy will be growing and so on, and what the Fed will be doing is, if they want to maintain the interest rate at 5%, well, they'll keep expanding M so the interest rate doesn't go up. Okay? That's the way it's normally conducted. But if the Fed stays sleepy and you have an increase in money demand, then the interest rate will tend to go up. So I told you that the central bank is moving M, increasing M, reducing M, or whatever. So how do they do that? I mean, it's not that they, although that policy has been advocated, it's not that they go in a helicopter and sort of fly bills on top of all of us. They don't do that. Although, again, it has been advocated in extreme cases of recessions and so on, and it's called helicopter money. Just give money away, okay? But that's not the way it's normally done. For normal operations, it's not done that way. So how is it done? Remember that we have a financial system that is very simple for now. We have money and bonds. So what the central bank does, if the central bank wants to change the portfolio of people, they want people to have less bonds, say, and more money. That's to reduce the interest rate. So what the central bank does is goes out there, an expansionary open market operation. Open market is because they go into the open market to buy bonds, okay? As opposed to an operation that happens behind doors. If the Fed went directly to the Treasury and bought bonds, that would not be an open market operation, okay? But what they do is they go to the financial system, and they go with a big bag of money, and they say, okay, we want bonds. And so the public sells bonds to them in exchange for money, okay? That's an expansionary market. So what we saw that before, when M shifts to the right, what the central bank really did is went out there and bought bonds from the public. The public sold the bonds and got the cash, okay, at some price. People, when I show you equilibrium in the money market, that means also an equilibrium in the bond market, necessarily. So it has to be that the price is right for the portfolio of individuals. A contractionary open market operation is the opposite. It's the central bank goes out there and sells bonds to the market and takes the cash back. Okay? That's a contractionary monetary policy. So when the Fed wants to, when the Fed, when the Fed wants to cut interest rates, what the Fed does is an expansionary monetary policy, which means it goes out there and buys bonds from the market and gives cash to the market.
How can a central bank in this instance guarantee that someone's going to buy their bonds? Like if they if their government didn't have the financial stability, I guess like the United States has, how would they guarantee that these bonds will be worth anything in the long run?
Well, I mean, you're talking about risk premium, and that's an additional issue. Typically, central banks intervene in very short duration bonds. So it's not the typical bond that is risky in many senses. It's very, very, very short duration bonds, treasuries, very short duration. In fact, it's even less. Nowadays, central banks really intervene in the overnight market. But you're right that countries that don't have a bond market, a well-developed bond market, have problems with the management of monetary policy and so on because they have a credit spread that is moving around as well. But they tend to focus on the type of instruments. That thing becomes very important. I mean, for Japan, even big guys, very big guys, now they have an issue because they have been buying bonds, very long duration bonds, so 10-year bonds and stuff like that. And there, it's a little trickier. Markets need to trust you a lot more if you're dealing with 10-year things and you're dealing with 3-month horizons and so on. In other instances, for example, Chile has a situation like that. The central bank itself can issue bonds. And so those are bonds issued by the central banks. And they tend to be very reliable bonds because these are bonds that are issued in your same currency. So you have the currency to always pay the thing. You can always print money and pay for those bonds, you see? So it rarely happens that there is default on bonds of that kind. The typical bonds, government bond that defaults is a bond that is issuing a currency different from the one you have, because then you may not have the currency to pay for the stuff. Okay, and that's the reason emerging markets run into trouble and things of that kind. Okay, so in terms of the balance sheet of the central bank, how does an open market operation look? So if you look at the balance sheet, this is an incredibly simplified version of the balance sheet of the Fed. No, they have lots of things, some more assets, gold and all sort of stuff. But in our simple economy, the government, the Fed, the assets of the Fed, they have some bonds. It has already some bonds out there. And the liabilities is the money they issue. They owe that to people. I mean, they issue currency, but it's a liability. People can do things with it, can buy things with that money and so on. It's a liability. So that's the way the balance sheet looks. So when the Fed decides to do an expansionary open market operation, then what it does is it goes out there, it issues, say, a $1 million expansionary open market operation. They do it in much bigger tickets than this, but let's make it simple. $1 million of an expansionary operation. But they go out there, they print $1 million, and they buy $1 million from the market. Okay? And so at the end, the balance sheet ends like it used to be. There's an extra $1 million of liabilities because now there's $1 million more of dollars circulating out there, but against that, the central bank also has $1 million more of bonds holdings. Okay. So that's what happens when an expansionary monetary policy, the balance sheet of the central bank expands. Both sides expand by the same amount, okay, but expands. And one of the big themes of recent years, starting from the global financial crisis, is that these balance sheets used to be small peanuts type things for, I mean, $1 trillion or something like that, for something like the US, the size. Nowadays, they're much, much larger than that, because they have done so many operations to first get us out of the global financial crisis and then to get us out of COVID and so on, that these balance sheets are now an order or 2 orders of magnitude larger than they used to be. Okay? But in other words, they have had to do lots of expansionary monetary policy over the last couple of decades or so. Good. So let me talk a little bit about interest rate and bond prices, because that's the other side of this thing. So what is the connection? Because sometimes it's easier to understand things in terms of prices than in terms of bonds. So suppose a bond pays $100 a year from now and no coupon in between. So if you buy a bond now for some price PB, you get $100 a year from now. So what is the interest rate of that bond? That is, what is the excess return that you get out of that, or the return you get out of buying that bond? Well, it's going to be $100 minus whatever you pay today. Say you pay 95, then $5, divided by your investment, initial investment, which was 95. Okay? So that's a bond that gives you, a little bit more than 5% in a year. Okay? That's the return. That's the interest. So that's the connection between interest rate and prices. And notice that this is an inverse relation. When the price of a bond goes up, the interest rate pays goes down because you're paying more for the same principal. You're going to get 100, but now you're paying more for it. Well, that means the interest rate, the return on that bond went down. Okay. Conversely, you can say the other way around. The higher is the interest rate, the lower is the price of a bond. So, for example, today the interest rate is 5%. If I want to issue a bond that doesn't pay any coupon, and I'm completely safe, so I'm the US Treasury, I'm going to be able to sell that bond for 95. 2 years ago, when the interest rate was 0, the Fed would have been able to sell that bond for 100. Okay? So there's an inverse relationship between the interest rate and the price of bonds. And now I can take you back to my open market operation. So remember what I said. There's another way of remembering sort of which way these signs go. Remember when you have an expansionary monetary operation, I said the Fed goes out there with a bag of money and buys bonds from the market. When you buy something, when there's an enormous increase in demand for something, what do you think happens to the price of that something? Goes up, for anything, cars, whatever it is. If there's a lot more demand, then prices will go up. And the Fed has a lot of cash, so he can really buy large amount of bonds. And so when the Fed goes out there and does an expansionary open market operation, means it goes out there and buys a lot of bonds, the price of those bonds goes up, and by that formula, that means the interest rate is going down. Okay, so that's another way of understanding how is it that an expansionary open market operation lowers the interest rate. It's because it raises the price of the bonds that is demanding. Okay. And when you raise the price of the bonds, then the interest rate goes down. Will I do this to you? Well, very quickly. So really, the only thing I really care, I want you to understand what I just said well, because we're going to use it. I want you to understand what comes next, ideally well, but it's okay if you don't understand it too well, okay? And I'm going to tell you when you have to start understanding very well again, okay? But for now, this is a piece in which what I'm doing here is making things a little bit more realistic. The message will be similar, but it's a little bit more complicated, okay? And that's the reason, sort of substantively, I already told you what I wanted to tell you. What I'm going to tell you now will give you a little bit more realism and therefore will allow you to understand a little bit better a technical description of monetary policy or something like that. So in practice, in the economy I just described, you had sort of households and firms and the central bank. But in practice, there are lots of financial intermediaries, okay? And in financial intermediaries, the most prominent of them, especially for monetary policy, are the banks. And there are certain banks, actually, that are even more important than others. But banks are financial intermediaries. They take money from someone or deposit from someone and lend it to someone else or buy some instruments, okay? So they intermediate the funds of somebody that wants to save in the bank, a deposit account or something, and they lend that money effectively in the name of the other person to someone else. Okay, so banks do two things to the model I just described. The first is that they produce money as well, okay? Because money is made of currency, which is issued by the central bank, but it's also made of checkable deposits. If you have a checking account, something you can have a debit card against or something like that, then that's money for you, okay? If you deposit in a bank in a checking account, that's money, okay? And so when banks, the liabilities of banks, the deposits, is part of money. It's something you can use for transactions. You can write checks, you can use your debit card, and stuff like that, okay? So that's the first thing that banks do, okay? The other thing the banks do is they themselves have a deposit account at the central bank, okay? So they themselves take part of the deposits, they take the deposits, part of the deposits they lend to other people, another part they buy financial instruments, bonds and stuff like that. In this economy it would be only bonds. And the other part, smaller part, 10% or something like that, they deposit at the central bank. That deposit at the central bank is called reserves, okay? So when you hear the word reserves of the banking sector, this is the deposits of the banks at the central bank, okay? And that's also a liability for the central bank. The central bank is holding that deposit of the banks. It's not the central bank's money, it's the bank's money, okay? And they're holding it there. It's a liability as well. So now, if you look at how the balance sheets look, our central bank now has more things. It has assets, it's going to be bonds. In this economy, it's the only thing it can have. But now it will have the currency that it had before, and in the liabilities, but also will have the reserves, the deposits of the banks themselves, okay? Okay, and this stuff here is called central bank money. In contrast, it's called central bank, it has so many names. It's called central bank money, high power money, some other name. And I have it somewhere, but it has several names. And what is it? But I like the name central bank money because that's in contrast with this kind of money. It's the money that the banking sector produces, the checkable deposits, okay? So this is the money produced by the central bank, and then through deposits, the financial system, the banks themselves, produce more money. So the total money in the system is much more than the central bank money, because deposits is a big thing, you know. This is much larger than that in practice. Okay, good. So how does this change our model? Not really much. And so again, that's the reason I don't care too much if you understand these last two slides. So let me rederive what we had with this approach, with this extension. So money demand is the same as it used to be. What happens is you're going to demand it in the form of currency or checking accounts or something like that, but the total money demand is exactly as it used to be. Banks typically hold a share of, and assume for now that there's no currency. So everything is deposits, otherwise you get a more complicated formula, okay? So no one holds cash, which is probably quite realistic nowadays. So everyone has a checking account and that's it. So the banks typically hold, for regulatory reasons, a share of their deposit. They have a minimum, for regulatory reasons, a minimum share of the deposits they have that they need to hold in the form of reserves. Okay? And I'm going to call that a fixed fraction, theta. So if all the money is held in the form of deposits, then theta, which is a number like 0.1, say, times the deposits, which is money demand, is equal to the reserves. Is equal to the demand for central bank money This is the demand for central bank money because these are the reserves that the banks want to have at the central bank. So they demand, they want to have this amount of deposits at the central bank. That's what we call HT. It's theta times MD. And so now, rather than M, what the central bank controls really, because it's the only thing it can really control, is the money that it issues, which is the central bank money. So rather than supplying M, which used to be currency, now M is a bigger thing because it has deposits and all sort of stuff, but the central bank is the one that controls how much high power money, how much central bank money it issues. And we're going to call that H. Okay? So if we go back to my balance sheet here, the central bank cannot control total money because it cannot control the amount of checkable deposits in the economy. But it can control this money here. And since we have no currency in my example, it really can control how much supply of reserves it can do. Okay? And so now we have a demand for reserves, which is just proportional to money demand, equal to some fixed amount, H, which is the supply of high power money by the central bank. And then the equilibrium looks exactly like before. It's going to be some, remember, before we had M equal to $YLI. Now we're saying it's not M, it's theta times M, really, no, because it's a fraction only of total money, okay? Has to be equal to money demand. It's not total money demand, it's the money demand that ends up being demand for central bank money, because total money demand is the checking accounts. That leads to a demand for central bank money by the banks, which is theta times those deposits. It's not the full deposit. They don't take all the deposit and deposit at central bank. They say only 10% of those deposits will keep them at the central bank. So $100 in deposit, if 30.1, $100 in deposit leads to a demand for reserves, that is for deposits by the bank at the central bank, of $10. Okay? And that is the thing that the central bank can control very well. It's the demand that comes to me, the central bank, is $10. And I decide whether we do $10 or not. You know, we can do 5, and then we're going to have the interest rate sort out 5 to be an equilibrium. So if the banking sector wanted 10, and I'm only going to supply 5, then the interest rate is going to have to rise so that deposits, decline, less demand for money, and the final demand that gets to me is 5, not 10. But the mechanism is exactly the same. I know this can be a little confusing, but the mechanism is exactly the same. This just illustrates, it makes it, I mean, this is important because it's institutionally important, more than conceptually important, because this is the market where really the interest rate is set. Okay? So this, I'm doing next time. That market, the market for reserves really, because what the banks do is they want reserves. Okay, deposit at the central bank. That market for reserves, the interest rate in that market for reserves is called the federal funds rate. And it's called the federal funds rate because the Federal Reserve controls that rate. So when the Fed, when there is a meeting by the Fed or a policy announcement that tells you that the Fed has increased the rate by 50 basis points, it means it has increased the interest rate in that market by 50 basis points. So the interest rate that the central bank controls directly is called the federal funds rate. And the federal funds rate is that market. It's a market for reserves, for high power money. So all the operations happen there. They don't participate in the deposit market or anything. They participate in that market, which every night is a huge number of transactions. Every night, because I put all the banks together, but what happens every night is some banks have more reserves than they need, some other banks have less reserves than they need. So they supply and demand within the banking sector for reserves, and there's an interest rate that tends to equilibrate. If too many banks are short reserves, then there's going to be lots of demand for reserves, and the interest rate is going to tend to go up. If the Fed doesn't want that interest rate to go up, then what it will do overnight, it will go there and inject reserves into the system, high power money, so the interest rate in that market comes down. Okay? And that's the way the Fed operates. That's the way it controls it. Participates in that market, controls the amount of high power money, which regulates the rate in the reserves market. And here it's only, and then, so here you have sort of the major banks participating here, And then this leaks into the other interest rates in the economy, into deposit rates, to bond rates, and so on. But the real rate they control, the rate that they control most directly, is that rate here. Okay? And that's the reason I wanted to give you a little bit of institutional, to add complexity so we could get so you could get to this word, federal funds rate, because that's what you're going to read in the newspapers. The Fed increased the federal funds target, it's going to say, because they target, they cannot guarantee it's going to be that. They target an interest rate, and typically they give you a range. It's a very narrow range. Okay. In any event, let me just conclude by showing you how that rate has looked in the US recently. Okay, and I finish here. So here is before COVID. Okay, the interest rate, the Fed was already hiking interest rates. It had overdone it there, so it was beginning to lower interest rate, and then COVID came. Boom, and they cut interest rate very aggressively. This is the maximum they can cut it to, and we're going to talk about that briefly in the next, to 0. You cannot go below 0. You cannot pay negative interest rate because then I don't demand money. I don't demand bonds. Why should I hold a bond that pays me a negative interest rate when cash pays 0, always 0? I can always keep it under the mattress, and I don't pay anything negative. So the interest rate, the lowest it can be 0. And you see that they did the maximum they could in terms of cutting interest rate. They went to 0, effectively 0. And now they have been trying to catch up because inflation is very high, and so they're trying to hike interest rate. And you see what they're doing. Okay? Well, all those interventions happen in the reserve market. That's where this is. That's the rate. It's in that market over there. Okay, so I think we're meeting on Tuesday next week. I think that's the plan.